The Beatles' Please Please Me album is their first true album and would be the kickstart they needed to move on from playing in Hamburg and the Cavern Club in Liverpool, which had become old hat by then. By the end of 1962, the Beatles were ready to go worldwide, and this was the album they were going to use to do it. Today, we're going to show you 10 very interesting facts about the Beatles' first album, Please Please Me. Please Please Me went on to sell millions of copies and was absolutely critical in propelling the Beatles into their dominating position as the greatest rock and roll group of all time. However, this album was not an instant hit. It in fact took 6 months for sales to top 250,000. After being released on the 22nd of March 1963, it entered the charts the next month in April and finally reached number 1 in May that same year. At this time in history, it was rather unusual for rock bands to actually record their own material, but instead perform pop standards and other established compositions. But the Beatles were anything but usual. 8 of the album's 14 songs were written by John and Paul, which exposed listeners to the validity of their songwriting prowess, and would ultimately have fans preferring the Beatles' originals instead of covers. I imagine that's every songwriter's dream, isn't it? The cover is nothing short of timeless, but it wasn't the original idea. George Martin, who initially wanted to name the record Off the Beatle Track, a pun on Off the Beaten Track, dropped the idea and they settled on Please Please Me. But interestingly enough, George also had some creative ideas for the album cover. He says, "I was a fellow of London Zoo and rather stupidly thought it would be great to have the Beatles photographed outside the insect house. But the zoo people were very stuffy indeed. We don't allow these kinds of photographs on our premises," quite out of keeping with the good taste of the Zoological Society of London. So the idea fell down. I bet they regret it now. I'm sure they regret it. So George enlists the help of photographer Angus McBean to photograph the boys at EMI's headquarters. George continues, "We rang up the legendary theater photographer Angus McBean, and bingo, he came round and did it there and then. It was done in an almighty rush, like the music. Thereafter, though, the Beatles' own creativity came bursting to the foray." The marathon session, the 10-hour recording blitz that would create this breakthrough album. The Beatles started recording at 10 a.m. on a Monday morning and exceeded George Martin's expectations because he booked the band 2 sessions and they bled well into a third. There wasn't a lot of money at Parlophone at the time, and George Martin was working with an annual budget of £55,000, and this Beatles session subtracted about £400 from that. Even if you adjust that amount to today's money, it would still be a steal to make record-breaking albums for only £10,000 in 10 hours. Before the Beatles became the kings of rock and roll, there was another band before them with the crown. From the late 1950s into the early 1960s, the Shadows had been dominating British pop music. With #1 hit after hit, they were the Beatles' competition and early inspiration. Even to the point that the Beatles' press officer, Tony Barrow, mentions the Shadows in the Please Please Me album sleeve notes, saying, "People inside and outside the record industry expressed tremendous interest in the new vocal and instrumental sounds which the Beatles had introduced." Brian Matthew, who has since brought the Beatles to many millions of viewers, described the quartet as visually and musically the most exciting and accomplished group to emerge since the Shadows. And as history has shown us, the Beatles left nearly everyone in their collective shadow. In a rare departure from what we're used to, this album is the only Beatles record to feature the McCartney-Lennon credit instead of Lennon-McCartney. Seriously, try saying it out loud. McCartney-Lennon. McCartney-Lennon. Sounds weird, doesn't it? I much more prefer Lennon-McCartney. Paul says they had intended to alternate credits for each album, so sometimes it would be John's name first and then it could be Paul's. But Paul continues saying Lennon-McCartney quickly became a good logo because Hammerstein and Rogers doesn't work. The title song of the album Please Please Me was inspired by an old Bing Crosby song called Please. John Lennon says, "I was always intrigued by the words 'Please lend your little ears to my please,' a Bing Crosby song. I was always intrigued by the double use of the word please." The Beatles saved Twist and Shout for last because they knew they would only be able to get 1 or 2 takes because of the pressure on John's voice. Not to mention, he had already been singing for about 9 hours. John took lozenges and gargled milk to soothe his throat so he can get through it. John says, "I couldn't sing the damn thing. I was just screaming." In February 1963, Helen Shapiro was Britain's most successful female singer, topping charts at only 14 years old 2 years prior. While the Beatles were on tour with her in the UK, her manager Norrie Paramore suggested that the band compose a song for Helen for an upcoming country western album. Paul brought the song they had been working on to the manager, saying, "We've called it Misery, but it isn't as slow as it sounds. It moves along at quite a pace, and we think Helen will make a pretty good job of it." But the manager declined, thinking it wasn't suitable. Reflecting back on that song, Paul says, "It was our first stab at a ballad and had a little spoken preface. It was co-written. I don't think either of us dominated on that one. It was just a job. You could have called us hacks, hacking out a song for someone. Its inclusion on Please Please Me is more than likely due to needing enough songs to make a complete album." George Martin wanted to capture what made the Beatles so alluring at that time, their live presence. So the first thing that came to him was to actually record where they made a name for themselves, the legendary Cavern Club. George even visited the club to figure out technical details for recording there. However, the timing didn't work out, and George had to book studio time instead. Although it wasn't a live performance, the band did do it with ferocity in mostly just one day, save the 2 singles they had previously recorded, and in a way it does have that indescribably live raw feel. John Lennon says, "That record tried to capture us live and was the nearest thing to what we might have actually sounded like to audiences in Hamburg and Liverpool. You don't get that live atmosphere of the crowd stomping on the beat with you, but it's the nearest you can get to knowing what we sounded like before we became the clever Beatles." Today, we're going to show you 10 very interesting facts about the Beatles' second studio album with the Beatles. Let's do it. Although With the Beatles was the Beatles' second studio album, it was the first to be released in North America. For the US release, it was split into 2 different albums. The first was titled Meet the Beatles, and the second was titled Beatles' Second Album. This was the first time US fans could get their hands on a Beatles vinyl, which further sparked Beatlemania in the US. With the Beatles was released the same day as JFK's assassination on November 22, 1963. Broadcasts were even taking place covering the exciting album release, until they cut to coverage and reporting of the assassination. Some music historians credit this tragic event in US history to be one of the reasons for the Beatles' massive success, as hopeful American teens who had just seen their beloved president killed wanted some joy in their lives. The album cover was an artistic leap. For their previous album, Please Please Me, the band had little control over the cover work. However, with the Beatles, the band was granted much more creative freedom. George says, "It is the beginning of us being actively involved in the Beatles' artwork. The first one where we thought, hey, let's get artistic. The cover also inspired many renditions and has been mimicked many times since its release." With the Beatles was recorded quite sporadically due to the band's other commitments. Concert tours across the US and TV and radio appearances meant that the album couldn't be recorded in a single day, which the band had done for Please Please Me, which would become more normal for them in their later years. The band received an award for the album before it was even released. With the album's 300,000 advance orders, the Beatles were awarded with a silver disc for the album's sales 4 days before it was released. The album contained the first song George wrote for the band. The track is titled Don't Bother Me, and George wrote it as an exercise to see if he could write. He says, "I don't think it's a particularly good song. It mightn't have been a song at all, but at least it showed me that all I needed to do was keep on writing and maybe eventually I would write something good. I still feel now, I wish I could write something good. It's relativity. It did, however, provide me with an occupation." Funny to think that George was once doubtful of his songwriting, as he would come to be a strong songwriter for the band in the future and into his solo career. I Want to Hold Your Hand, possibly the band's most famous song from their early years, was only included on Meet the Beatles album, and it had previously been released as a single in the UK. However, the song was so beloved by fans, it altered the American charts and outsold the single. It was rare at the time for an album to be a hit over a single, the power of the Beatlemaniacs. The album featured 8 original songs and 6 covers. This would be the second and last album for the Beatles to have this many covers, as their next one, A Hard Day's Night, had none. That being said, the Beatles honor many of the greatest hits from Motown, rock and roll, and R&B, including Chuck Berry and Smokey Robinson. The band received their name, the Fab Four, from the sleeve notes in the With the Beatles vinyl. Beatles press officer Tony Barrow included the phrase, the Fabulous Foursome, and the media quickly abbreviated it to the Fab Four, a nickname that would be used for the rest of the band's career. With the Beatles fueled Beatlemania in the US, Fans had been waiting for the band's music to be available for purchase in the US, and when it finally was, they went crazy for it. The younger generations, particularly young teenage girls, love for the Beatles' music sparked a phenomenon that has yet to be matched in the music industry. Their admiration and mass support is remembered not only as a significant cultural moment, but also as a thank for the Beatles' success. The Beatles' A Hard Day's Night is one of the most iconic early 60s rock albums of all time. With songs like the title track, A Hard Day's Night, Can't Buy Me Love, and If I Fell, this is Beatles at its purest and a foreshadowing to the great experimentation to come. Today we're going to show you 10 very interesting facts about the Beatles' album A Hard Day's Night. Let's do this. John and his son Julian Lennon's relationship has often been depicted as estranged, but at this moment Julian had just had his first birthday, and John was in attendance for his boy's milestone. John had the title for the song from Ringo, which we'll get into a bit later, and the lyrics came flying out to him. So fast, in fact, that John reached for whatever scrap of paper he could find, and seeing that Julian had just had a birthday card fit the bill. He wrote what seems to be the bulk of the lyrics on it, and scratched out the phrase, "My tiredness is through," for "the things that you do," based on a suggestion by a close friend and journalist Maureen Cleave. The birthday card with original lyrics is on display at the Sir John Riblatt Treasured Gallery at the British Library. Recognize this chord? Well, it's so recognizably Beatles that many consider it to be as iconically Beatles as the last chord in A Day in the Life. And for good reason. Hard Day's Night's film director Richard Lester implored the band to open the title song with something grand. George Martin recalls, saying, "We knew it would open both the film and the soundtrack LP, so we wanted a particularly strong and effective beginning. The strident guitar chord was the perfect launch." Many have debated exactly what this magic chord was, and in an online chat with George Harrison back in 2001, he confirms it was an F chord with a G on top, meaning an F add 9. But you'll have to ask Paul about the bass note to get the full story. Currently, the going performance of the chord suggests it is George Harrison with the F add 9 on an electric 12th string, John playing an F add 9 on an acoustic guitar, Paul playing a D note on the A string of his bass, and George Martin playing D2, G2, D3, G3, and C4 on a Steinway. Woo-wee, all for one chord, and boy oh boy, if that's not rock and roll, I don't know what is. Speaking of magic, Maureen Cleave, who suggested John fix up some lyrics for the title track, remarks on how quickly the song came together after he brought it to the rest of the band. She says, "The song seemed to materialize as if by magic. It consisted of John humming to the others, then they would put all their heads together and hum, and 3 hours later they had this record." They truly were unrehearsed, which can be heard on the Anthology 1 album. Paul seems to be struggling a bit with the chord changes, and George's guitar seems more likely he was trying to figure it all out. Most people are aware that the title A Hard Day's Night came from Ringo, who is known for his malapropisms, just getting things grammatically incorrect in an adorable way. But John actually used Ringo's phrase before the song in his book in his own right. That piece, Sad Michael, reading, "There was no reason for Michael to be sad that morning, the little wretch. Everyone liked him, the scab. He had a hard day's night that day, for Michael was a cocky watchtower." Dick Lester suggested that that should be the title for the movie/album, since he liked the phrase so much. John recalls saying, "So Dick Lester said, we're going to use that title, and the next morning I brought in the song. 'Cause there was a little competition between Paul and I as to who got the A-side. It may not seem like a big deal, but after years and years of making a name for themselves by playing other people's songs, till this day Twist and Shout is one of their more popular recordings. The Beatles finally have an album all to themselves, marking an absolute end of an era, where the boys could dominate their own albums with their own songs, and if they did a cover, it was only because they really wanted to." A Hard Day's Night, out of the entire Beatles discography, is the only album to be strictly a John Lennon and Paul McCartney composed one. No Ringo, no George, no covers. However, Paul recalls his biggest regret was not allowing George Harrison more of an opportunity to write songs earlier on, especially after his performance of I'm Happy Just to Dance With You, which was written by John Lennon. John and Paul alternated singing lead on every other song on the album, but George's voice really shined through quite nicely on that one. George actually met Pattie Boyd for the first time on the set of A Hard Day's Night in 1964. She had a tiny, uncredited performance in the film as a schoolgirl and only spoke one line.
Prisoner?
George was enamored and showed interest in her, but she initially resisted because she had a boyfriend at the time. However, George persisted, and it certainly paid off because they were married 2 years later. Although Ringo is actually considered to be the best Beatles actor by a few directors, and praised for his lonely walk along the river in this film, Ringo actually admitted his perfectly downtrodden performance had a bit to do with drinking too much and being hungover. He says, "Getting up early in the morning wasn't our best talent, and there's an example of that in one scene, the one for which I got really good credit, walking by the river with a camera, the Lonely Guy piece. I had come directly to work from a nightclub, very unprofessional, and was a little hungover, to say the least. I was so out of it, they said, well, let's do anything. I said, let me just walk around and you film me, and that's what we did. And why I look so cold and dejected is because I felt like shit. There's no acting going on, I felt that bad." The Beatles had gone worldwide, and every Beatles fan should know the many alternative titles to A Hard Day's Night in other countries and languages. The film was titled Yeah 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 in Germany, All for One in Italy, Four Boys in the Wind in France, Yeah Yeah Here We Come in Finland, The Kings of Yeah 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 in Brazil. I don't know why, but these just crack me up. A Hard Day's Night had advance orders of 250,000 in the UK and sold 600,000 copies by the end of 1964. Over 1 million advance orders were placed in the US, and within 3 months it had sold another 1 million copies, making A Hard Day's Night one of the fastest selling albums of all time, dominating the charts across the globe for weeks and weeks, and ultimately being a catalyst of an album that would catapult the Beatles into their greatest songwriting years. That's all for today, everyone. These are just so much fun to make, and I hope you're having as much fun watching them. I'll keep putting them out if you keep enjoying it. Beatles For Sale is the 4th studio album by the rock band The Beatles. With songs like No Reply and 8 Days a Week, it has been a fan favorite ever since its release. Today, we're going to show you 10 very interesting facts about the Beatles album Beatles For Sale. Let's get into it. Although it would still be classified as an album from the early period, Beatles For Sale differs greatly from the 3 albums the Beatles had released previously. Unlike the love songs that made fans swoon on Please Please Me, with the Beatles and A Hard Day's Night, Beatles For Sale was slightly darker and moodier. Paul says, "We got more and more free to get into ourselves, our student selves, rather than we must please the girls and make money. Which is all that From Me to You, Thank You Girl, P.S. I Love You is about." The songs on Beatles For Sale, such as I'm a Loser, I Don't Want to Spoil the Party, What You're Doing, and No Reply, showed the Beatles were moving in a more mature direction. Beatles For Sale marked the time when the Beatles were becoming more and more experienced and hands-on in the recording studio. George Martin, the band's producer, was starting to give the band more control over their music and was becoming more open to their non-traditional ideas. George Harrison also explains how their comfort in the studio was beneficial for the album, saying, "Our records were progressing. We started out like anyone, spending their first time in a studio, nervous and naive, looking for success. By this time, we had loads of hits and were becoming more relaxed with ourselves and more comfortable in the studio. And the music was getting better." Many of the songs on Beatles For Sale are covers, a total of 6 songs, including Rock and Roll Music, Mr. Moonlight, Kansas City, Words of Love, Honey Don't, and Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby, are all covers of popular rock and roll artists, such as Chuck Berry, Carl Perkins, and Buddy Holly. This means that almost half the album wasn't written by the Beatles, the last of their albums that would have this many covers. Beatles For Sale is the album where John and Paul's writing styles first began to noticeably differ. While John contributed to self-deprecating songs like I'm a Loser, Paul wrote the more cheerful I'll Follow the Sun. The difference between each of these songs' lyrics and tempos shows how the two were moving their separate ways in terms of songwriting and starting to write less together. The Beatles were working on Beatles For Sale when they met Bob Dylan. They started working on the album in August, but then departed for a tour in North America. While they were in New York, they met Bob Dylan. This is where we get the famous interaction in which Bob Dylan introduces the Beatles to marijuana, after thinking they were singing I Get High instead of the line I Can't Hide in their song I Want to Hold Your Hand. The Beatles returned to the UK to finish recording Beatles For Sale, meaning there could be influences of the drug in certain songs. The album has a large Western influence. In fact, at the time of its release, John described Beatles For Sale saying, "You could call our new one a Beatles country and Western LP. You can hear this Western sound in songs such as Babies in Black, I Don't Want to Spoil the Party, and Every Little Thing, as well as many of the songs the band chose to cover." Part of the reason for why this album explored this genre so much was because the Beatles had previously been on tour in the US and were exposed to the country radio stations. Ringo had also been urging the band to dabble in Western music, given his love for country stars. The album never had a proper release in the US until 1987. Instead, 8 of the 14 tracks were put on Beatles 65, an album released by Capitol Records 2 weeks after the release of Beatles For Sale. The remaining 6 songs were put on Beatles 6, another Capitol Records release. However, this LP wasn't released until 1965. Therefore, Beatles fans in the US never really experienced Beatles For Sale in the way it was intended. The songs on Beatles For Sale were actually quite innovative for their time. The fade-in introduction on 8 Days a Week was the first time this had ever been done on a pop song. Every Little Thing was one of the first songs to feature a multi-track bass guitar, and George's version of Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby incorporated innovative vocal delays and a heavy tape echo. So, although the music might not be considered experimental, especially in comparison to the Beatles' later work, Beatles For Sale was still responsible for helping push the boundaries in the studio. The album's cover and title have slightly cynical connotations. Beatles For Sale was released at the height of Beatlemania, a time where the band was exhausted from touring, publicity events, and screaming fans. As for the cover, the Beatles are shown with blank stares, looking weary. This contrasts their other album covers, which are much more upbeat and cheery. The title, Beatles For Sale, has also been said to be a reference to the fact that the Beatles were so successful to the point where the band members themselves were treated as commercial products to be sold. This idea, in combination with the cover, shows the more cynical perspective the band had towards their fame. Although it might not have been their most popular album, Beatles For Sale was still a leap forward in the band's career. With both classic Beatlemania-type songs and the newer, grittier material from John, Beatles For Sale was a pivotal album that showed the band was moving towards a new style of music that was less focused on fan reactions and more focused on personal introspection. Additionally, given that the album was a massive success, it proved to the Beatles and the world that they could venture out and try new things while still keeping their incomparable fan base. The Beatles' Help is a fascinating chapter in music history. With Revolver and Rubber Soul looming in the future, Help and the previous A Hard Day's Night marked the Beatles' middle period, a time where thoughtful, emotional, and even painful compositions were becoming the standard instead of the exception. Songs like Yesterday, You've Got to Hide Your Love Away, and of course the title track, Help, created one lovely album. Today, we're going to show you 10 very interesting facts about the Beatles' album, Help. Let's do this. This was a strange time for the Beatles, and thankfully John Lennon was usually so keen on being candid about his emotions. They had the fame and money, but things were still off for John. Generally regarded as the peak of the Beatles' fame, John was mired with insecurity, even bemoaning his weight gain. John says, "The whole Beatles thing was just beyond comprehension. I was eating and drinking like a pig, and I was fat as a pig, dissatisfied with myself, and subconsciously I was crying for help. So it was my fat Elvis period." You see, the movie, is very different, very insecure, and he's completely lost himself. And I am singing about when I was so much younger and all the rest. Looking back at how it was, John never seemed to garner happiness from fame and fortune, but it is said being honest and open about your pain can be almost medicinal. Maybe he was so forthcoming in his life because he found it cathartic. That little exclamation mark has such a silly story behind it. Help's film director Richard Lester said that when the movie was being prepared under the unimaginative working title Beatles 2, the writers and Lester wanted to call it Help. No added punctuations. Unfortunately, they were informed by copyright lawyers that someone else had already registered that title. So, after Ringo's suggestion of 8 Arms to Hold You, referencing the deity in the film to an unenthusiastic response, they rang the lawyers up again and asked them if the other movie's title had an exclamation in it. The lawyer said no, and boom, that's how Help got its exclamation mark, and possibly what influenced John to make it sound like an explosive holler in the chorus. A lesser-known move on behalf of the Beatles that Brian Epstein made was shutting down the idea of the lads branching off with solo records while they were the Beatles, maintaining the integrity of the group. When Paul was recording Yesterday, the song that had no other Beatles members on it, George Martin recalls how quickly Brian dismissed the solo idea. George said to Brian, "You know, this is Paul's song. Shall we call it Paul McCartney?" He said, "No. Whatever we do, we are not splitting up the Beatles." So even though none of the others appeared on the record, it was still the Beatles. That was the creed of the day. I'm going to do an episode on Brian Epstein. He might not have been musical, but he sure was brilliant. Now this is a big shift. Instead of recording a bunch of takes by the entire band and choose the best ones to edit, the Beatles began to record the rhythm track first and adding vocals, overdubs, and other instruments later, a method that is the industry standard up till now. This was also the time they introduced reduction mixing, meaning a 4-track tape was consolidated to a copy in which it freed up a spare track for overdubs. By using reduction mixing, it allowed the Beatles to be more adventurous when recording. See, there are always these tiny things that blossom into why these songs were so great. We never really hear too much confrontation from George Martin. Always such a gentleman, full of class, it's hard to think anyone would have trouble getting along with him. However, George and the film's director were not exactly friends. George says, "I produced all the tracks for the film, but I wasn't asked to do the scoring. Another guy was offered the job. Dick Lester and I didn't hit it off well on A Hard Day's Night, and the fact that I got an Academy Award nomination for musical direction probably didn't help either." Even when talking about not getting along with someone, George still maintains his iconic level of professional decorum. Obviously, India had a massive influence on the lads from Liverpool, especially George, but interestingly, they were exposed to the East right there on set for the first time. John recalls, saying, "The first time that we were aware of anything Indian was when we were making Help, and on the set in one place they had sitars and things. They were the Indian band playing in the background, and George was looking at them." Then, about 2 years later, George had started getting into Hatha Yoga. He got involved in Indian music from looking at the instruments on the set, all from that crazy movie. Long before Matthew McConaughey was driving a Lincoln before he was paid to, Lincoln Mercury, 15 years after the Beatles split in 1985, paid £100,000 for the right to use Help in a commercial, making it the first Beatles song to be licensed for this use. George Martin helped create a Beatles-like version of the song by a sound-alike group, as the license did not include the Beatles recording. Photographer Robert Freeman, who had previously worked on the album covers for With the Beatles, A Hard Day's Night, and Beatles For Sale, had an interesting idea for Help. He says, "I had the idea of semaphore spelling out the letters Help, but when we came to do the shot, the arrangement of the arms with those letters didn't look good, so we decided to improvise and ended up with the best graphic positioning of the arms. If translated, the Beatles are spelling NUJV in semaphore. I wonder what it would have looked like if it had said Help." There are 2 covers on Help, the first being Dizzy Miss Lizzy, and the second is Ringo's Act Naturally. Act Naturally was the Beatles' last cover recording all the way until the Let It Be sessions in 1969. They used to need covers to help sell records, but by this point they were the band other people wanted to cover. John wasn't too kind towards the Beatles' catalog years after they broke up, but he did love a few songs, one of them being Help. In a 1970 interview, one of his last interviews, John remarks on how honest Help really was. He says, "The only true song I ever wrote were Help and Strawberry Fields. They were the ones I really wrote from experience and not projecting myself into a situation and writing a nice story about it, which I always found phony. The lyric is as good now as it was then. It makes me feel secure to know that I was that sensible, aware of myself back then. That was with no acid, no nothing. Well, pot." That's all for today, everyone. I'm really digging making these types of videos. I've been moving around quite a bit, literally across the states, but now that I'm settled, I intend to get back in front of the camera like we did when we started this whole thing. I really hope you enjoyed this video. The Beatles' Rubber Soul, the musical shift that would lead to challenging what rock and roll really is and was. More pop-friendly songs like Can't Buy Me Love and She Loves You were great, but the Beatles decided to see what else they could offer. With songs like Norwegian Wood, Michelle, Girl, and In My Life, this album marked the dawn of the new, reinvented, ready to experiment even more Beatles. Today, we're going to show you 10 very interesting facts about the Beatles' album, Rubber Soul. Let's begin. They had the music, the fame, the money, for the most part, but the Beatles were anything but complacent and wanted to explore different styles of songwriting. Paul says, In October 1965, we started to record the album. Things were changing. The direction was moving away from the poppy stuff like Thank You Girl, From Me to You, and She Loves You. The early material was directly relating to our fans, saying, please buy this record. But now we'd come to a point where we thought, we've done that. Now we can branch out into songs that are more surreal, a little more entertaining, and other people were starting to arrive on the scene who were influential. Dylan was influencing us quite heavily at that point. Photographer Robert Freeman took this photo at John Lennon's home in Weybridge. He said he wanted another angle of the group and a different tonality, greens, browns, and black. When Robert showed the Beatles the slides of their photo shoot, Robert used a piece of cardboard the same size as an album and projected the images onto it. But the cardboard fell backwards just a little, and the result was enchanting. Paul says, it was stretched and we went, that's it, rubber soul, hey, can you do it like that? And he said, well, yeah, I can print it that way, and that was it. The Beatles and comedy is nothing new. The boys are hilarious, but the banter, probably stoned if we're being honest, during the rehearsal session for Think For Yourself is a little piece of history every music fan should witness.
Pooh, and I stink too. I'm waiting for somebody to say something about it.
It's that anti-odorant you use.
It isn't.
It is.
Cynthia licked it clean before we left.
Let me tell you. It's that BO odorant, that deodorant you're using.
Here's to a prosperous
Deodorant. That great big deodorant. It's great big deodorant.
Even the Beatles had to woo their fair share of girls, but Paul often had a brooding strategy for it that involved a little French number. Paul had been writing songs since the 50s and used to play a primitive version of MICHEAL at parties. He said that John's art tutor, Austin MICHEAL, would throw all-night parties and you could maybe pull girls there. Paul would sit enigmatically in a corner wearing a black turtleneck sweater, playing this French-sounding tune on his guitar, even pretending that he could speak French. After a few years, John asked him, do you remember that French thing you used to do at Mitchell's parties? Paul said yes. John responded, well, that's a good tune. You should do something with that. So Paul's French tune at Mitchell's party thus became Michelle. If you love the Beatles, then there's a massive chance you adore the Beach Boys. It makes sense because they were inspired by each other, especially after Rubber Soul's release. Musical genius Brian Wilson recalls that fateful listening session. He said, Rubber Soul blew my mind. When I heard Rubber Soul, I said, that's it, that's all folks. I said, I'm going to make an album that's really good. I mean, really challenge me. I mean, I love that fucking album. I cherish that album. So Brian makes Pet Sounds, which is an earth-shatteringly fantastic album, and in the same spirit of competition, Paul was inspired to create Sgt. Pepper's after hearing Pet Sounds. Paul says, Pet Sounds blew me out of the water. I love the album so much. I figured no one is educated musically till they've heard that album. I've often played Pet Sounds and cried. I played it to John so much that it would be difficult for him to escape the influence. Before All You Need Is Love, Revolution, and other anthemic masterpieces, The Word is often looked over as the Beatles' first anthem for love. John says, it sort of dawned on me that love was the answer when I was younger. On the Rubber Soul album, my first expression of it was a song called The Word. The word is love. In the good and the bad books that I have read, whatever, wherever, the word is love. It seems like the underlying theme to the universe. Everything that was worthwhile got down to this love, love, love thing. And it's the struggle to love, be loved, and express that. That's fantastic. There are a few theories on where the title Rubber Soul came from, but we're going to give you two sides and let us know in the comments what you think. Mick Jagger was making a name for himself with the Rolling Stones in blues, but it is said some older blues musicians didn't really feel he had the soul. Paul says, I just read about an old bloke in the States who said, Mick Jagger, man, well, you know they're good, but it's plastic soul. So Plastic Soul was the germ of the Rubber Soul idea. But John Lennon, as usual, maintained that it wasn't really that thought out by saying that was Paul's title. It was like Your Blues, I suppose meaning English soul. Rubber Soul is just a pun. There's no great mysterious meaning behind all of this. It was just four boys working out what to call their new album. John had written What Goes On way back when he was with the Quarrymen. They resurrected it because they were scrambling to get songs onto Rubber Soul, and interestingly enough, it's credited to Lennon, McCartney,
and Star, making it Ringo's first official songwriting credit. Ringo remarks, "I used to wish that I could write songs like the others, and I've tried, but I just can't. I can't get the words all right." Neil Aspinall remarked that Paul showed Ringo What Goes On a multi-track tape, and after listening to it, Ringo added his own ideas before the recording session, giving him compositional credit. Great job, Ringo. It was a time for firsts, and not just for Ringo. After recording What Goes On, the Beatles attempted the song 12-bar original. Having a feeling of improvisation, including George Martin playing harmonium, it didn't seem likely it was seriously considered to be released on Rubber Soul. It was rumored that Rubber Soul was originally intended to have an instrumental track, and most likely it was 12-bar original. Also, when asked if there was an unreleased Beatles song after the breakup, John says, "Some lousy 12-bar." Notice that the album has no The Beatles logo. That's because the boys were so famous their likeness alone was enough to sell albums, making it the first album by the Beatles to do so. After years, as Paul says, of begging people to listen to their records, Rubber Soul marks the Beatles as we know them to be, experimental, often playful, boundary-pushing musicians that would change the world of music forever. That's all for today. Man, I love this album and Revolver so much. They are like siblings in my eyes. Or ears. If you had to choose just one, which would it be? Hard question, right? Let me know in the comments. Building off the adventurous 1965 album Rubber Soul, the Beatles created Revolver, their 7th studio album, and their last recording project before retiring from performing live. A boundary-pushing collection of songs that many put on their list as one of the best Beatles albums ever. Just look at this song list: Taxman, Eleanor Rigby, Here, There, and Everywhere, Tomorrow Never Knows. Today we'll be showing you 10 very interesting facts about the Beatles album Revolver. None of Revolver was ever performed live, even though the album was released a few days before the Beatles began their last tour, which concluded in late August 1966. The band didn't think that the album could be properly executed live, given the many technical innovations and studio-produced effects Revolver included. It would have been nearly impossible to replicate the songs with the technology during that time. In addition to the headache that was touring, this was another reason why the Beatles decided to stop touring. Their music was becoming more experimental, and they didn't want its inability to be performed on a stage to stop them from creating the music they wanted and stunt their growth. It was the last Beatles album changed for the North American market. Up through Revolver, Capitol Records, the band's U.S. label, had always altered the UK versions of the Beatles albums. They would change the order of track listings, the songs included on albums, and could basically rework or create new albums out of existing songs. This is why there are so many albums in the early days of the Beatles. They are all Capitol releases and are basically compilations of songs, not actual albums. However, the Beatles demanded a change, and Revolver ended up being the last time this would be done, other than the slight exception of Magical Mystery Tour, meaning albums were more consistent across the board. The album wasn't always going to be called Revolver. Ringo suggested that it should be called After Geography, after the Rolling Stones' recent released album Aftermath. Other possible names were Four Side of the Circle, Beatles on Safari, Fat Man and Bobby and Abracadabra. The band ultimately decided to name the album Revolver after asking themselves, what does a record do? The answer, it revolves, so the album was a revolver. The backing vocals for the album's track, Yellow Submarine, were done by an array of notable guests. The Rolling Stones' Brian Jones not only sang background vocals, but contributed to some of the sound effects. Actress Marianne Faithfull, who is Mick Jagger's girlfriend, and model Pattie Boyd, George Harrison's wife, also sang background vocals. Additionally, many people who were part of the Beatles team did as well, including producer George Martin, manager Brian Epstein, sound engineer Jeff Emmerich, and roadie Mal Evans. The album was released in the wake of a Beatles scandal. John Lennon's famous remark, "We're more popular than Jesus now," was receiving massive backlash around the world. People were demonstrating their outrage towards this comment by boycotting the Beatles and their music. All of this commotion was reaching a height just days before Revolver was released. This left Brian Epstein, the Beatles manager, terrified of what would happen in terms of sales. However, despite John's controversial statement, Revolver was a massive success and topped the charts. The album cover was designed by KLAUS VOORMANN, a close friend of the Beatles. The Beatles met KLAUS while they were touring Hamburg in the early 60s. VOORMANN created a beautiful black and white psychedelic piece for the album's cover, which consisted of tiny pictures of the Beatles. Paul McCartney comments on KLAUS's cover art, saying, "He knew us well enough to capture us rather beautifully in the drawings. We were flattered. If you look close, you can see some familiar images." The iconic drumming on Revolver is in partial thanks to a four-neck sweater. The drums on Revolver are distinctly deeper than usual. Jeff Emmerich, the Beatles sound engineer, explains why this is the case. He says, "I moved the bass drum microphone much closer to the drum than it had been before. There's an early picture of the Beatles wearing a woolen jumper with four necks. I stuffed that inside the drum to deaden the sound. Then we put the sound through Fairchild 600 valve limiters and compressors." Although this was an unconventional and rather untechnical method, many studios are said to have tried to replicate Ringo's drumming and the unique sound it created after hearing Revolver upon release. Revolver was the first time artificial double tracking was ever used. EMI Studio sound engineer Ken Townsend invented this technique for the purpose of Revolver. Artificial double tracking was used throughout Revolver to create unique sonics and influence many future rock classics, including Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody. Revolver was the Beatles' first step towards creating psychedelic music. In fact, the last song of the album, Tomorrow Never Knows, has been called the first ever psychedelic recording. Although there were definitely some psychedelic bands and songs already in existence at the time of its release, Revolver and tracks like Tomorrow Never Knows were responsible for bringing the psychedelic genre into the general public's consciousness and made it more mainstream. Without the Beatles, it is possible that psychedelic music would have remained relatively unknown and confined to a small niche of music listeners, especially since the Beatles' psychedelic music influenced many other popular bands to follow in their footsteps. Revolver drastically changed the musical landscape the Beatles would cover for the rest of their time as a band. While many people claim that Rubber Soul was the album that marked the shift from their early music to their latter, Revolver seems to fit the criteria of this claim much more appropriately. Revolver introduced daring and cutting-edge sonics into the Beatles' music that were unimaginable to their audience and the general public up until that point. The music literally came out of left field. Revolver was also crucial in setting the stage for their Sgt. Pepper album, which took the world by storm and put psychedelic music front and center. Therefore, it is arguable that Revolver was not only one of the most important albums in the Beatles' career and discography, but of all time. Thanks for watching, we hope you enjoyed the video, and be sure to leave your favorite Revolver fact in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching, and special thanks to contributing author Leah Robbins. Be sure to check out some of our other videos on music, such as Why Did Freddie Mercury Write Bohemian Rhapsody?, The Story Behind Toto's Africa, and if you're a Beatles fan, well, let's just say this is your channel. Thanks to the amazing patrons who keep this channel alive, and if you're into super underground music, then definitely check out the Hollyhobs on Spotify, Apple Music, and everywhere music is streamed. If you want to be notified when new videos are out, at this point you'll have to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and pray that YouTube will recommend anything you actually might want to see. If you have an idea for a video, please be sure to leave a comment. See you next time.